Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to the third day of 2 weeks of Elizabeth Gaskell. Today I'm going to be talking about my Lady Ludlow. I am an old woman now, and things are very different to what they were in my youth. Then we, who travelled in coaches, carrying 6 inside and making a 2-day journey out of what people now go over in a couple of hours with a whiz and a flash and a screaming whistle enough to deafen one. My Lady Ludlow was first published in 1859. In general, it is referred to as a novella, but it's 80,000 words, which I personally consider a novel. It is fairly obscure, but as Elizabeth Gaskell novellas go, it's probably a little bit more well known, partly because it was adapted alongside Mr. Harrison's Confessions and Cranford into the TV miniseries Cranford, which was on a few years ago. Lady Ludlow is one of those books that I have very mixed feelings about, because there are some things about Lady Ludlow that I adore and I think are wonderful, and there are some things that I'm just quite meh about, and there's a big long section in the middle that I don't really understand why it's there. But beside that, to try and tell you a little bit of what my Lady Ludlow is about. It is at its heart a character study. It is told from the perspective of an old woman looking back on her youth in younger days at around, I think, the turn of the 18th to 19th century, and she's looking at what happened when, as a young woman, after the death of her father, she was sent to live with a wealthy, distant relation who was Lady Ludlow. This young woman, Margaret, goes to stay with Lady Ludlow and lives for several years with her, and in her later years she looks back on her time with Lady Ludlow and examines Lady Ludlow as a person. The narrative technique of this first-person narrator, who is not the main character in the story, is a really interesting technique of Gaskell's that I quite enjoy, and it's a similar technique to that is used in Cranford. Margaret is not the main character of this book, and Margaret's story is always in the background and less important than my Lady Ludlow. At the same time, Margaret's a really interesting character, and that we do learn about her is really interesting, but for the most part the book focuses on this interesting character, Lady Ludlow. The book doesn't have that much of a narrative. As Margaret fully admits herself, I will try and tell you about her. It is no story. It has, as I said, neither beginning, middle, nor end. One of the things I do love a lot about my Lady Ludlow is what an interesting character Lady Ludlow is, but she has so many opinions that were quite conservative and quite intolerant and quite backward for like 1800, really quite backward and conservative by 1859 when this was published, and so immeasurably backward and different to what we think now that it makes her, in some aspects, quite dislikable. She believes that servants and that people of the lower classes should not be taught how to read. She has the highest respect for class and rank and blood, and a great belief in a social order that perpetuates inequality. And yet Margaret portrays her in such a way and gets us to see the good side of her character as well as the bad, that we grow to have a real understanding for her. There are also so many complexities and contradictions in her character which I find really interesting. One thing I find fascinating about Lady Ludlow, which I think is really interesting, is how, although she views the world as very, very divided in terms of class, she doesn't view it at all divided in terms of gender, and she thinks that women can really do anything that men can do. When Mr. Hornby takes on the clerk who is the son of a farmer, she is incensed that he dare try and teach a member of the lower classes how to read. She replaces this clerk boy with a female clerk, with a woman from the neighbourhood, because while she detests the idea of a farmer's son being trained up to be a clerk, the idea that a woman could not do this intelligent work is completely ridiculous to her, and she does not understand why Mr. Horner objects to having a woman when the woman she puts in place is perfectly capable and competent, despite the fact that Mr. Horner is rather afraid of said woman, Miss Galando, who is amazing and incredible, and I love her. My Lady Ludlow's continual sort of intellectual wars with her steward and agent, Mr. Horner, and also with the local clergyman are absolutely fascinating to read about. Another thing I find really interesting in my Lady Ludlow is the presentation of disability. There's a great tendency in Victorian literature of authors to display any characters with any kind of disability or deformity as either victims or as villains, and one of the few authors who I think definitely doesn't do this and has very complicated and psychologically complex and interesting presentations of characters with disabilities is Elizabeth Gaskell. Disability and deformity is actually something that crops up a lot in Elizabeth Gaskell's work. Over the course of the book, the narrator of My Lady Ludlow, Margaret, becomes less and less able to use her legs. She talks about the constant pain she is in and the kindness with which Lady Ludlow treats her, and while this is not at all the focus of the book, I do think it's really interesting and a very complicated and personal look at a character with a disability, especially because in Victorian literature while there are quite a lot of characters with disabilities presented, it is quite rare to have one as the narrator. And even though the story isn't focused on Margaret, it is focused on My Lady Ludlow, we do get to hear quite a lot about her situation and how she feels about her increasing inability to walk. At one point in the book as well, a boy from the lower classes has a serious accident in which he breaks his thigh in a manner that means he'll probably not be able to walk for the rest of his life. And one of the ways in which the characters fight against Lady Ludlow's distaste of educating the lower classes is exploring how dangerous it can be for people who are reliant for their way of life and for their income solely on their hands, what happens when they are in some way disabled, and how actually education and intellectual life and the ability to have a fulfilling, rewarding career that doesn't rely on you walking and using your hands and legs is really, really important. And that boy's storyline is really interesting in this book as well, and another interesting example of Gaskell looking at disability in characters and characters who find other ways of living, characters who have personalities which are not entirely dictated by their disabilities, as very often does happen with characters with disabilities in Victorian literature. As you can see, there are a lot of things I love about My Lady Ludlow. I think she is a wonderful character, and I really love Margaret the narrator. Even though the story isn't on her, we do still get to find out a lot about her through the way that she tells things and through the information that she does give us, and that I find really, really interesting. I also think it's a wonderfully fascinating portrait of these big estates and the tenants around them, and how that kind of particular rural setup, which in many ways a sort of hang up from feudal times, was still very, very influential and important, and how that operated in the late 18th and very early 19th century. I think that's really fascinating as well. But the reason why I don't love this is in the middle there is a huge chunk about the French Revolution where Lady Ludlow just like tells a story to Margaret for like a third of the book. This huge section in the middle where she's narrating this tale of the French Revolution that she had from someone who had from someone else, and I just don't really know what it's doing there. I mean, I kind of do, and I know that for Lady Ludlow, who is so concerned about the current social system, who is so concerned about her status and has such a respect for aristocracy, and who is so conservative, the French Revolution and the violence of it is for her the expression of everything that is wrong with liberal thoughts, everything that is wrong with reform, everything that is wrong with change. And that is really, really interesting to look at, but I don't think we need that massive section. But it's a lot of story within a story of reported speech that Lady Ludlow would never know, of a story that feels mostly irrelevant about someone she didn't really know. And I've read My Lady Ludlow twice, and I think if I sat down and studied it closely, I could find more things to compare. But for me, it feels poorly structured, and I kind of wish that it had either been much shorter or kind of not there. Because there are so many things I love about My Lady Ludlow, but that big French Revolution section in the middle I find quite dull and a bit tangential, despite the fact that I find the French Revolution really, really interesting. I did a module at university which was about the French Revolution, but more specifically about how the French Revolution has been interpreted and reinterpreted from 1789 up until now. So Victorian depictions of the French Revolution, such as Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities or here in My Lady Ludlow, I find really interesting. But I just wish Elizabeth Gaskell had written a separate short story with that story of the French Revolution and then My Lady Ludlow, because it just doesn't feel like it should be there. I don't know why it's there. It doesn't feel quite right. Despite that, I do think My Lady Ludlow is a good read, and I would highly recommend it, especially because while the middle third is weird, the first third and the last third are so good, and there are so many interesting themes explored here, and Lady Ludlow is such an interesting character that I would recommend it, but just be warned about the weird bit in the middle. I didn't love that bit. Please let me know if you have read My Lady Ludlow and what you thought. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back tomorrow to talk about another Gaskell book.